Hello and welcome back to our World War I series. Today we're going to be discussing the role of spheres of influence in the lead up to the First World War and see where we go from there. And we welcome back Dr Simon Peaple. So welcome back to the programme, Doctor.
Hi, nice to see you again.
And if you don't mind, I'll just jump in with the main question of the video. So, there's this theory about the First World War that's been floating around and even cited by the Kremlin in recent years, that prior to World War I, all the nations of the world existed within a sphere of influence of a great power, and that there wasn't really a sort of international community that set the rules or anything, just each great power governed its sphere of influence. How did these spheres of influence work prior to 1914?
Well, the spheres of influence in Europe were mainly outside of Western Europe. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, classically you had the Russians who negotiated, fought, or otherwise construed and constructed a sphere of influence in the Balkans. Similarly, Austria-Hungary was seeking to do a similar thing, which of course leads to 1914 and the problems at Sarajevo. But the fundamental idea, certainly you mentioned the Kremlin putting this idea forward, really it's just a way of justifying what was happening before, but in terms that don't sound too aggressive. At the end of the day, Ukraine didn't exist within the Russian sphere of influence prior to 1914. It was part of the Russian Empire. And as such, to claim that the Ukraine should now be part of Russia and is a sphere of Russian in the sphere of Russian influence is as much as to say that, once upon a time Britain ruled the whole of Ireland. Therefore, that the Republic of Ireland should be re-invaded by Great Britain. I think if that happened, people would be, very much questioning the moral motivation and justification. So I don't think it's any different for the Russians in the Ukraine, but it's a convenient argument. I think the wider issue that Putin is harking back to is the one which said that Russia had a sphere of influence. Russia felt secure within its area of influence, and that was because the Russian Empire was big enough to extend as far as it needed to, that the core of the Russia was protected. And you can see the same after 1914 with Stalin. Stalin, arguably in 1938-39, is worried about his border with the Germans. So what does he do? He says, well, I'll do a deal with the Germans, they won't invade me and I'll get these territories, which used to be part of Russia, which used to protect what had become Leningrad, and therefore this was a solid, sensible thing to do. Obviously it then involved a deal with Hitler, which proved to not be worth the paper it was written on, but that's another matter. But that tradition was still there. And the real, perhaps, Russian grievance is that Tony Blair, in particular, argued for NATO to expand, to include the countries that used to be part of the Russian Empire, that used to be part of the Soviet Union, and that therefore he pushed NATO closer to the core of Russia than Russia was really capable of feeling comfortable with. So I think that's where the issue lies. Before we go on to the First World War, shall I go on to the pre-First World War state of things?
Yes, please, that'd be great.
So if we think about Europe before the First World War, on the eve of the First World War, there are those who've argued there were no nation states. They all came along after as well. Tell that to the Italians and the Germans who'd formed their own state in the 19th century, and indeed to those who had achieved independence in places, small countries like Norway. So therefore there was nationalism, there were nation states, but there was a potential balance, if you like, between those nation states and the great powers, the powers that drove the rest of Europe, and arguably were the ones that took Europe, therefore, into war in 1914. There was a significant difference in that there was, most of the time, no actual fighting. And some people have said, oh, well, that was it, Europe was at peace between 1814 and 1914, allowing for Waterloo as a little sort of interlude after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, primarily. And really, that's not true. I mean, if you look at the war that saw Belgium emerge from the United Provinces after the Napoleonic Wars, if you see the unification of Germany, which was undertaken through a number of wars, then you've got the emergence of other countries, such as Hungary, getting more and stronger in its sense of identity. Kossuth and his team may have failed to get an independent Hungary in 1848, but the idea of Hungary existed very clearly before the First World War. And in fact, the differentiated response between Hungary and Austria in 1914 reflects that. They were very much believing that they could exist as a separate country. Wedded to the war, yes, in many ways, but nonetheless being a separate country. The Ausgleich of 1867 had given them that joint status, and they then asserted that status over the lesser nationalities in the empire. And obviously that was part of the reason for Sarajevo in 1914. So there is nationalism, but there are spheres of influence. So for example, Britain had a colonial empire, had a very large colonial empire, but it didn't try to influence the Balkans, where it felt that Russia and Austria had their interests. And interestingly, in 1915-16, when there's a debate over what to do with regard to Greece and Constantinople, in attacking Constantinople, there's some discussion between the Greeks and the British government. And the Greeks would have loved to have been promised that they would have Constantinople, and that did not happen. And it didn't happen because Istanbul, as it is today, was effectively promised to Russia. Britain said Russia had the right to take it over. So here you had a sphere of influence where Britain, despite its long-standing rivalry with Russia, was prepared to see Russia gain control of the Straits. What it didn't want to see was Russia gain control of Persia. It didn't want to see problems there with Russia. It certainly didn't want problems on the Indian border. But it was prepared to say, this is your part of the world, not ours. And if you want a parallel to that famous Sykes-Picot agreement in the Middle East between Britain and France, where France saw the Lebanon and Syria as its natural sphere, whilst Britain wanted to see its protection of its route to India via the Middle East, in terms of the areas down with the Gulf of Hormuz and the Suez Canal. So that was a greater emphasis for Britain, what they could do to control those key waterways. For the French, it was access to parts of Africa, stroke Middle East, that suited their interests and provided them with economic opportunities.
So, there's one thing that perhaps some people have asked over the years is, what exactly did decide where an area was when it came to whose whose sphere is whose, because I mean, after all, Britain doesn't exactly border any of the regions that it's saying or it's in its sphere of influence. So what was it decided? Who got what?
Well, I think a lot of that is historic roots. So, for example, Britain had a very strong influence in the Mediterranean. Because it had a strong influence in the Mediterranean, that meant that it was interested in what would happen to the Suez Canal. 1/5 of all the trade going through the Suez Canal was British. So you couldn't really rule it out for its significance for Britain. So therefore, what did you do? Well, you tried to make sure that nobody else interfered. So in 1882, when the Egyptian nationalists threatened to revolt against the rule of the nations which had bailed the Khedive out, Britain went in. It asked the French to join them, didn't particularly want to have a sole right to Egypt, but when the French said, due to various local political issues at the time in France, no, we're not interested, the British went in anyway. That then caused the French to say, well, you know, if you're going to have Egypt and control Egypt, then we want somewhere else. So they took control of Algeria and the big areas of the desert in North Africa. So they saw their influence in North Africa opposite their own country to a degree, and that was fine for them. And Britain wanted its trade, and therefore it made sure it maintained the Suez Canal. You've got to bear in mind, Britain had real traditional concerns about protecting its trade. It was a maritime-based empire, it needed trade, therefore it stationed its navy around the world and insisted on its trade routes being protected. But beyond that, there was no great desire to have control so long as no one else tried to have control. So spheres of influence fitted. If you go to look at another area, then as I've mentioned the Balkans already, it'd be worth just saying that, you know, from the Russian point of view, they had been expanding into the Caucasus, for example, in the 18th century, beginning to and gaining control of the Caucasus in the 19th century by fighting what was then Persia and is now Iran. The logic of that was that they controlled the territory from Moscow, they then grabbed the next bit and the next bit after that, and therefore the resources and trade that went with it. So they were doing what the British were doing, except theirs was overland, and in what today is often seen as part of the traditional area for them. If you look at Japan, its belief was that Korea was a natural part of the Japanese trade empire. The idea of a co-prosperity sphere might have diminished what was really happening as to who was paying for it, but nonetheless the idea that the Japanese had a sphere of influence, and that was reinforced by their defeat of Russia and by their alliance with Great Britain, which were both designed to ensure that its corner of the world was maintained.
So, was the sphere of influence a form of realist politics in the sense of how it's governed?
In terms of realpolitik, yes, it was largely down to practical realities. So, for example, if your country hadn't got enough influence, then not enough resources were put into the area and you didn't get to control it. The key change was the Treaty of Berlin in 1884, which governed the expansion in Africa. Up until that point, most of the empires had been informal. There was generally an approach which said, this is how your traders are going to get on, and our traders are there, your traders are there, and there's no need to get everybody uptight about whose flag is flying where too much. I mean, there was always tension, but not absolutely requirement. Whereas once the Treaty of Berlin had been signed, it was necessary for countries to actually say which areas they controlled. So therefore what happened was that places started to declare control over areas that they perhaps practically already ran, or where there was trade that they wanted to secure. So you would have to send troops, put up a flag and say, this is where we are. That gave you the right of occupation and therefore the right to negotiate for resources, mineral rights, or whatever else you were looking for.
Slightly following on from this idea, jumping to 1919 for a moment and the foundation of the League of Nations, because this moment's often seen as a bit of a seismic shift in international relations history, whereby instead of being a more realist approach as we've seen earlier, we move towards a more idealist way of governing the world for an international community following a set of possibly vague values. Do you feel that 1919 did represent a seismic shift in how the world was governed?
I think it was meant to look like things had changed. Certainly Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations idea were designed to say the old world is not going to carry on. The groups of powers that sort of dominated everything had dragged Europe into this appalling war with such carnage. None of that was supposed to happen again. And so you had this view that you could change it. However, when you look at the way in which America followed on from that, it used its position to enforce great change in its favour. So, for example, the Washington Naval Treaty gave it parity of military weapons and navies with Britain and France, in the knowledge that they could afford such a big navy. Britain and France couldn't, so it was actually pushing them into a joint #1 slot of naval power. So there's a real tension between the idealism and what actually happened. And that becomes true when you look at the League of Nations, because they managed to solve certain things like the Ireland Islands. Lovely that they did that. But a dispute between Sweden and Finland doesn't really constitute a major brokerage of power. Whereas once they had to decide an argument between, say, Italy and the rest of the European powers, France and Britain notably, then it wasn't able to do it. So there is an idealistic theme, but it's not working beyond a certain level.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Millie and Alfie for your appreciation of the talk.
Thank you for having me back.
Thank you to Dr Simon Peaple for talking to us today about the spheres of influence in the run-up to World War I, and some more besides. Hope you enjoyed it, and it was lovely having you here.